Well, prior to what I said at the end of my last review, this video isn't going to be next week. It's going to be right now. I'm sorry about the delay of the videos. I was pretty sick when I made that last video, and I wasn't really able to finish it off in time. So I figured I'd do the double post today. That being said, this review is on Book 2 of the Tome of Fire series, Fire Drakes, continued by Nick Kime. Okay, now it's going to be tough for me to talk about this book without giving you spoilers about the first book. Yes, this book does continue right after the last book. Well, a little bit of time has passed. But I'll do my best to try to not spoil any of the surprises in the first book. Now, to really get what's going on in this book, you do need to read the first book. And if you want some extra info, especially with some of the stuff they talked about in flashbacks, you're going to need to listen to the audio drama Fireborn. I didn't even know there was an audio drama. I went into this book not even knowing that existed, and every time they refer to events that happened in that drama, I was completely lost. It does feel like there was another story in between, well actually there is another story in between, that I completely missed out on. Now it's not completely necessary you listen to the audio drama, but it does really help, and it clears up some confusion that happens with some of the characters. That being said, let's keep talking about this book. Now this book has three main stories you gotta follow. Now the first story follows Dagger, and that's probably the main story that's really trying to push the plot ahead. And when I mean pushing the plot ahead, I mean throughout the entire trilogy. The second main story is based on Chaplain Elysius, and that's the main story I'm really interested in. See, I'm a huge fan of the chaplains in any of the Space Marine chapters. They always seem to be the most interesting and coolest characters, depending on who's writing them, of course. And if you're not sure what a chaplain is, think priest with a shotgun. I mean, check it out. This is my own custom-built chaplain. It's pretty awesome, right? Well, I think so. That's right. Chaplains are the ones with the skull mask helmets. And the last main story revolves around Sugan, who has just been appointed to the first company Fire Drakes, which is the best and most prestige company in the entire Salamanders chapter. Oh yeah, and Forge Father Vulcan's there too. And I will admit, he is a pretty awesome character. But that's enough beating around the bush. Let's start talking about the main premise of this book. After the events in the first book, Dagger travels with the librarian Pariel to try to uncover what's going on with the Dragon Warriors, the Chaos Space Marine chapter that's trying to take out the Salamanders. And while they're off doing their investigation, Chaplain Elysius and a squad of Salamanders have gotten captured by the Dark Eldar on another planet while they're in the middle of a war. And the Fire Drakes, along with Sugan, who's just been inducted, has been sent on a mission to rescue Elysius because he's holding the almighty MacGuffin that they need to proceed with the plot. And Forge Master Vulcan decides to join them to help them in the rescue mission. Now that pretty much is the book in a nutshell. But let's dive a little bit deeper. Now I did mention some of the characters in the last review, but not all of them. Let's start off with Chaplain Elysius. Yeah, the Chaplain! For the Emperor! Now while all chaplains wear that skull mask helmet, Chaplain Elysius is known for never taking off his helmet, and nobody's ever seen his face outside of the helmet. At least nobody alive. And there's a little bit of a mystery as to what his face really looks like. And the big reveal, it's fairly obvious. But Chaplain Elysius acts like a chaplain should act like. He's a guy that has pure faith, doesn't second guess his actions. He knows what he's doing, and he knows what he's doing is right. And he doesn't hesitate to smite the enemies of the Emperor. All the while trying to keep spiritual purity all among the Salamanders and anybody else who worships the Emperor, or believes in him. He doesn't have to be Space Marines and humans. And now we're introduced to the Forge Father, Vulcan. Now what the Forge Father is, remember when I mentioned that the Primarch Vulcan has kind of scattered his junk all over the galaxy for Salamanders to find? Well, the Forge Father is he's like the best Space Marine in the Salamander chapter who's been chosen to go search for these items. And Vulcan has claimed some of these items, and he's on this never-ending quest to try to collect them all. So he is highly revered by all the Salamanders, even the chapter master. And finally, we get the librarian Pariel. Now, he has been touted to be one of the most strongest librarians throughout the chapter, second only to the head librarian. And he is essentially Dagger's guide, his teacher, his mentor, through the transformations Dagger's going through. So he's kind of like the old wise man who mentors the young hero. Although really, I don't know who's older between the two. They're definitely not young. He's one of them. Oh, and a character I did forget to mention in the last book is the main villain. Although in the last book it was kind of iffy who the main villain was because there's a lot of stuff was going on in that one. His name is Nihilin, I think. And he is, from what I understand, a former salamander. He's gone rogue, became a Chaos Space Marine, started up his own chapter, the Dragon Warriors, kinda. But as far as his history goes, all you really know is he's an ex-salamander who became a Chaos Space Marine. So this battle was very personal for both the salamanders and the Nihilin. And he's a very strong psyker. In fact, I believe him and Pariel both train together. And he is out to cause some major destruction to the salamanders. The question is, how is he going to do it? Well, anyway, let's move on to the story. Now, I'm going to be a little brief on the story behind Dacker. Mostly to try to stay away from spoilers from the first book, but mainly because it's not really that major in this book. Okay, some really important stuff happens, but it just feels like this story is an afterthought to what happens with Chaplain Elysius. Dacker is going through a transformation. Nobody's sure if he's able to control what's going on with him, and everybody's scared of that. And while he's trying to control what's going on, he and the librarian, Pariel, are in an investigation to try to discover what the Dragon Warriors are doing. So Dacker and Pariel are trying to find out what Nihilin's plan is. And that has them kind of planet hopping, sort of. Trying to get bits of information on what's going on. But really, what the story's about is if Dacker is able to control his power. Now, while I said earlier that it's the only real story that tries to push the plot forward, I mean that in a way that what's going on with Dacker is really a very major thing. But when it comes down to it, when you're reading this book, at least when I was reading this book, I didn't really feel that invested with that part of the story. Only because I was really interested in what's going on with the chaplain. For the Emperor! Yeah, and can you believe I'm not single? Anyway, let's go on to the main story. The one revolving around Chaplain Elysius. I was going to show you my chaplain again. So, orc. The chaplain is sent off leading a small detachment to fight the Dark Eldar, which are invading this one Imperial planet. And somehow they are betrayed and captured by the Dark Eldar. And then they're taken to some Dark Eldar planet that's in another dimension, sort of. And now they're doing all they can just to survive. It's kind of like a hunting games that the Dark Eldar are trying to do. They capture people, then they kind of throw them on this planet, and they hunt them for sport. And what better sport is a Space Marine? So not knowing if they'll ever get rescued, all they're trying to do is survive as long as possible. And throughout this time, you get some very good character moments with the chaplain. He tries his best to stay strong to his fate. But after all this goes on this planet, all the horrible events that are happening, even he's starting to get to the brink of starting to waver just a little bit on his fate. And while they're on this planet, they actually end up running into another group of Space Marines. And they're from the Black Dragons. And the Black Dragons are a pretty cool chapter. They essentially have this mutation with their gene in which their bones are coming out of their body. Kind of like Wolverine has his claws coming out. Except it's not just their fist, although one of them does have like bone spears coming out. And they use these bones that are sticking out of their body as weapons, and it's really cool. And the more I kept reading on that story, the more I just wanted it to keep going. But of course, throughout the chapters, it kept switching between the other two stories, and I just kept wanting it to go back. I mean, that's not to say the other two stories are bad by any means. It's just that one, that's what got my attention. That's what I wanted to know. That being said, let's go on to the last story, the one with the Forge Father and Sugan. Now, Sugan, he's still having his issues from the first book, where he was a masochist and he's just super ultra violent. And he just couldn't control himself, and all he wanted to do was fight, because when he fights, he doesn't think about anything. But when he's not fighting, all he's thinking about is all these emo thoughts. And the Forge Father, he's a pretty cool character. He's like universally knowledge. You know that term, worldly knowledge, but kind of like with the universe. But he's also kind of a lonely character, because in his quest, he's been traveling alone, so he kind of missed his bonding with his battle brothers. And they're sent along with several other members of the first company on a rescue mission to try to rescue Chaplain and Eliza's. And while I did kind of like some of their battles, the main thing you're really going to like, at least the main thing I really liked, was the interaction between Sugan and Forge Father. While Sugan was still going through his like bloody rage emo kind of thing, it's actually the Forge Father that brings him to his senses, not by lecturing him really, but really by doing like not just what he says, but in his actions and the way and how he carries himself. Finally, Sugan has somebody he can look up to. And that story does have, obviously, a much more direct link to what's going on with Chaplain. So those two stories just work well in this book. What's going on with Dagger seems to be like it's coming from another book. While not a bad story with Dagger, it does seem very out of place. Overall, this book, it only really serves as a link to the first and the final book in this series. A lot of things that are happening feels kind of superfluous, but on its own, it's not a bad book. There are those 3 stories, and you do need to read the first one to know what's going on. And it does end with you having to read the third one. And in trying to link the first and the third book, but I will admit, what's going on with Chaplain and Eliza's, although that was my favorite part of the book, it was completely unneeded as far as linking the first and the third book together. That story could have been taken out, and it wouldn't really have changed the series at all. The story of the Forge Father was only really needed just to introduce the Forge Father into the series. And, well, technically something happened with Sugan that kind of needs to be there. And Dagger's story is just there just to show that his changes are really powerful changes. But if you read the first book, and if you want to read a really awesome story with a chaplain, don't worry, I'm not going to do it this time, and I mean it.
I kick ass for the Lord!
Then this is not a bad transition. Then I really recommend you pick up this book. If not for the Chaplain story, then to at least finish the series, if you're interested in finishing the series at all. But you would have known that already if you read the first book. So, health rolling, I have my next and last review in the final book of the Tome of Fire series. And that's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth.